Hello and welcome guys to yet another episode of Coffee with Steve, which means I answer all of your questions which you have posted during the week. And if you find value during any time of this video, make sure to hit that like button, and if you're not part of this community, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And without too much further ado, without too much talking, let's dive into these questions. Alright, so question number one comes in from Mohammed, and he asks, is there a difference between Go routines and OS threads? Yes, my friend, there are a couple of differences, that's why let's explore a couple of them. And the biggest difference of them all is the fact that Go routines are much more memory efficient and CPU efficient because they are very tiny and small data structures built in Go, which means they can shrink, they can grow, and initially they are very small, which means you can run millions of Go routines as opposed to running tens of thousands of threads. And they are also very CPU efficient because you don't spawn as many threads, as many OS threads as Go routines you spawn, meaning you don't have a one-to-one mapping, which makes it very CPU efficient, and it makes it use less CPU burst, less context switching and all that stuff. Speaking of OS threads or application specific threads, they are very inefficient when it comes to managing them and distributing work, and this is where again Go shines with its Go routines because it's got the Go scheduler. And speaking of the Go scheduler, it has a very smart way of distributing work, of making sure threads are working equally, of making sure a thread has work to do, making sure another thread is not too busy. And generally Go has taken this one step further, meaning you don't really have that much control when it comes to managing thread. All you really have to do is simply invoke the keyword Go, and that piece of code, that piece of functionality is going to run concurrently. In my opinion, this is a much better approach. So let me show you a quick piece of code right here. And if you look at this example, as you can see, we have a function called sum. It accepts two numbers, and then we have a couple of invocations of these functions inside the main function. And basically by simply putting in the Go keyword in front of them, you make all of them run concurrently and perhaps in parallel if you got multiple cores yet again. And this is just mind-blowing how simple it is to use, and all of the things that the Go scheduler and the Go runtime does for you in the background. So the next question comes in from Tanush V, and he is asking, what's the use of func init? Well, before I go ahead and answer this question like very briefly, I want you to go ahead and check out one of my older videos right here where I talk about all of the workflow and all of the behind the scenes that happen in a Go program, including the init function. So here are a couple of things you need to know about the init function. The init function pretty much does what it says. It initializes resources, so that's why the init function is part of every package, whether you declare it or not, whether you make use of it or not. So basically when you create a package, you have the possibility to create a function called init, and that function will get called automatically for you when you import that package. And now let's have a look at a very simple example when it comes to the init function right here. So as you can see from this example, we have two files. The first file is called f1.go, the second file is called f2.go, and they are both part of the same package, the package pkg. So inside the f1 file we have a init function declaration, and inside there we print f1 init. Inside the second file we print f2 init, and then we have the package main as usual. And basically this underscore in front of the import line declaration means that use this specific package only for side effects, meaning call the init functions from all of these files. And in fact, this is what's going to happen. It's going to get printed f1 init, then it's going to get printed f2 init, because this is what really happens when you import a package. The init function is going to get called for you. The next question comes in from Kishor, and he's asking, before switching to Go, what did you use JavaScript for, front-end or back-end? Also, what was your tech stack? So when it comes to my past regarding JavaScript, I really use JavaScript for pretty much anything. I use JavaScript for front-end and I used it for back-end. When it comes to the tech stack, when it comes to front-end specifically, I used React, TypeScript, and a little bit of AngularJS as far as I remember. And I guess that was my stack when it comes to JavaScript for front-end. When it comes to the JavaScript for backend, it's nothing fancy. Again, I used Node.js, of course. I used MongoDB as a database, and a lot of the times Express as an HTTP router, and a bunch of other frameworks which, you know, JavaScript has. But at the end of the day, if you want to find more about my journey from JavaScript to Go, make sure to check out this video if you haven't already. And the next question comes in from Brian C12, and he's asking, what do you think about the discussion of Golang dominance Python, or Golang dominance over Python? Well, it's a very interesting question. It's also a tricky question. That's why I will try and answer this in a different way. I will not say pick one or the other, and we're not here to talk about one versus the other. I'll say pick the right tool for the right problem. I would pick Python Python 10 out of 10 when it comes to using it for machine learning and data science. I would also use Go 10 out of 10 when it comes to using it for like microservices, systems, backends, and really efficient and robust applications. I would definitely not use Python. I would stick to Go rather. Also, when it comes to Python, I would probably pick Python if I were a startup, if I wanted to build something very quickly, very fast. I don't know, Django, Flask, that will solve my problem. And that's why if I were a startup and I wanted something very fast, something which works out of the box, I would pick Python. I wouldn't even think about Go. Think about what kind of a problem you're trying to solve, because you're not a programmer and you can't really use a tool for everything. That's why pick the right tool for the right problem. All right, moving on to the next question coming in from HallowGap, and he asks, what are some project/portfolio suggestions to make that show I have enough Go understanding to work in that language? This is a very good question in my opinion, and this concerns a lot of beginners out there or people who want to get their first job when it comes to Go. So first and foremost, I want you to focus on real-world projects, not toy projects. Problem with toy projects is the fact that they will not land you a job. That's why focus rather on real-world projects. And by real-world projects, I mean you have to put in a little more work and you have to implement a little more things. A very solid ground would be a CRUD app. Then you would want to add something like authentication to that application. Make sure the application is secure. Make sure it has some sort of authentication, which a lot of systems, a lot of companies out there use. After that, I advise you to add in some communication between processes, services, and all that stuff, something like an event bus or something like that, because chances are a lot of companies out there will test you on that, will ask if you know or have some experience with that or in that regard. Also, make sure your application has good logging, errors, and all that stuff. Add in monitoring and instrumentation so that you can monitor your application while it's live, so that you can diagnose problems and all that stuff, because a lot of big companies out there use this kind of approach. And of course, try and implement design patterns when and if needed. And this is as well something which can be seen with good eyes when it comes to portfolio and projects that you have done or worked on. And bottom line, at the end of the day, have a correct mindset. Be a problem solver, not a programmer. And the next question comes in from HenriqueAlexandre, and he asks, hi Steve, can you explain the difference between YAML and JSON? So yeah, before we dive into the difference between YAML and JSON, I want to lay out or stress that they pretty much do exactly the same thing. They're trying to solve exactly the same problem, just in different ways. And yes, of course, there are different use cases for one or the other. It's not really about one versus the other. It's about using one or the other depending on the use case. When it comes to JSON specifically, JSON has been on the market for quite a while and it has a little wider adoption. You'll probably see JSON everywhere in REST APIs and config files and many more things. When it comes to config specifically, JSON can get very ugly because of the curly brackets and because of the notation in general. JSON can get very ugly. That's why I would rather prefer YAML, which is a human readable format, which is something which looks cleaner. And for configs specifically, I would rather prefer to use YAML. But the problem of YAML is if you're trying to edit YAML without a special editor or IDE, chances are you're gonna mess up the indentation and the spacing and you're gonna get errors. And in general, the spacing and the indentation can get quite messy. And this is the thing that I don't really like about YAML. Now, speaking of JSON, I would probably use JSON most of the times as a message format, meaning if I have REST APIs which communicate between them, yes, of course, I'll use JSON. I will not use YAML. And also when it comes to YAML format, it has a couple of extra types, which makes it more interesting to use, because the more types you have, the more descriptive you can be. And I think this is an advantage when it comes to YAML specific. Another good thing I like about YAML is the fact that it accepts commenting. And this is why I said I prefer YAML for configs. You would normally have comments there. You would normally want to comment what each config means, what are the defaults, how you can use this config and all that stuff. And JSON doesn't really allow comments, meaning YAML has an advantage when it comes to this specific thing, because we do commenting in programming, and yeah, specifically config files would require comments. That's why I prefer YAML for configs. And lastly, let's have a look at a small example, a small comparison between YAML and JSON right here. So as you can see from the example, we have two files which pretty much do exactly the same thing. However, one of them looks much better. In the case of YAML, as I said before, it has a little bit more extra types, and yeah, they pretty much do the same thing. This is a config file, but I would prefer YAML in this case. And the next question comes in from Marat Ermeshev, and he asks about the overview of hexagonal architecture in Go. This is an alternative to the layered architecture which we are all used to, and this is just a different way of solving pretty much the same problem, and the problem is really architecting or laying out your components inside your application. So first thing you need to know, usually the application in this type of architecture is divided into core, ports, and adapters. This is the way that you can separate your application and your application logic so that you can swap them out. You can swap implementation easily without breaking changes, without affecting the entire application. So typically your application core is the generic code, the generic core of your application, which would make use of ports. Now when it comes to ports, ports are loosely coupled components of your application, usually downstream services, databases, event streams, and all that stuff. And these are likely present in service-oriented architectures or in microservices. Now when it comes to adapters, adapters are really the glue between the real world, between the client, and between the application core, which makes use of those ports. And lastly, hexagonal doesn't have anything in common with number 6. And now let me show you a small diagram so that you have a better understanding of what exactly is hexagonal architecture. So let's have a look at a small diagram right here. So as I said before, in the middle you have the core, and on the left side you have the adapters, which are the ways that we communicate with the real world, and the core communicates with the ports on the right side, something like MySQL port, Mongo port, HTTP port, gRPC port, and many other kinds of ports that we can think of. So hopefully, Marat, this answers your question. This answers, gives you an overview, or gives at least other people who didn't know, including myself, about this type of architecture, gives them an overview of what exactly is hexagonal architecture. As I said before, I'll cover this in a special and separate video. The next question comes in again from HenriqueAlexandre, and he asks also, would you mind giving a brief intro about JWT? Now, I've talked about authentication in the previous episode, and I've talked about JWTs as well. So this is a very good opportunity to also talk about what exactly is a JWT and how exactly can we use it in authentication specifically. So right off the bat, JWTs can be used for different things, but most of the times they will be used for authentication. They will be used to carry user-specific authentication data in order to authenticate and authorize the user which is trying to make a specific request. And as I said before, the JWT can be very vast. You could carry a lot of information in a simple token, in something which looks cryptic, but it carries a lot of information when you pass that along the request. You could really think of JWT as context, like you could throw in some data into it, you can secure that data and pass that data along the network. And when it comes to JWT specifically, make sure you don't throw in sensitive data, because this is not really the purpose of JWTs. Make sure to throw in data which would give the server a clue of how to authenticate the specific user, things like user ID and all that stuff. Now let's have a look at a small diagram when it comes to JWT so that you have a better understanding of what exactly we're talking about. So let's have a look at a small diagram right here. So as I said before, this is the way the JWT looks. It's usually base64 encoded. It consists of three things, the header, the body or the payload, and the signature, and they are all separated by dots, as you can see in the encoded section. And also, if you're trying to decode this, you could use tools like jwt.io. It's a very good tool. I recommend reading the article. I recommend reading the introduction. I'll link it in the description. Make sure to check that out. But generally, this is what you will most likely use on the server when you're trying to decode this JSON. You're gonna try and use this payload. I'll make sure to cover this in some sort of authentication video series, but this is again a brief overview of what JWT is and how can we use it. And finally, the last question comes in from GamingBeast36, and he's asking, what is the benefit of programming in a procedural language such as Golang other than its speed? So benefit number one, as you mentioned, it's of course speed. It's not as fast as C or C++ would be, but speed is definitely something you would consider if you're trying to switch to Go. So when it comes to Go, we could say that Go does have OOP. Yes, it's OOP the Go way, but it does have OOP, so you can't really say it's a procedural language. It also has interfaces, packages, and a bunch of other data structures which are built into Go, and you could just use them without worrying how they work or reinventing the wheel. It does embrace the procedural world procedural, the procedural realm which C and C++ gave us, but it also tries to fix all the problems, tries to implement modern solutions. So bottom line, I want to say that Go does look and feel procedural a lot of the times. However, it brings a lot of good things on the table, a lot of modern solutions which other procedural languages don't usually have. So I guess this pretty much answers your question, and this is pretty much it about your questions that you have posted this week. And lastly guys, before we wrap this video up, I wanted to thank my newly joined patrons. I wanted to thank Fernando, Terry Davis, and Yohan Mokan. These are the people that believe in my dream, believe in this cruise and this journey of mine. And with this opportunity, allow me to remind you that this has become my full-time job recently. And if you feel like contributing or supporting, head over to patreon.com, and there you can support me with whatever you got. But if you don't want to contribute, I still love you all and appreciate all of you for simply being part of this community. But if you're not part of this community, make sure to hit that subscribe button and also hit that like button if you like this video, if you related to this video, and make sure to share this video so that as many people know about it. So make sure to post your next question by simply using the coffee_with_Steve hashtag, and I'll make sure to look for them. I'll make sure to include them in the list, and we'll see each other in another episode of Coffee with Steve. Peace.